There is a mountain range in the eastern part of North America that has been standing longer than almost anything else on this continent. The Appalachians are old, older than the Atlantic Ocean, older than the dinosaurs. They were once as tall as the Himalayas, and time wore them down into something softer, something that looks, from a distance, almost gentle. And yet people who live in those mountains and people who have ventured into them have been telling stories for a very long time. Stories that don't quite fit the official version of things. Stories that get passed down through families, whispered at the edges of campfires, written in journals that never made it into history books. In the next 2 hours, we are going to move through every major theory, legend, piece of folklore, and genuine mystery that has attached itself to the Appalachian Mountains over the centuries. We will talk about things that disappeared, things that were seen, things that allegedly lived in the hollows and the ridgelines and the deep, fog-covered valleys where the light doesn't quite reach the way it should. We will talk about ancient civilizations that some researchers believe existed long before anyone was supposed to be here. We will talk about creatures that don't appear in any biology textbook. We will talk about disappearances that have never been explained, doors in the earth that allegedly lead somewhere else, and a quiet, persistent belief held by some people in those communities that the mountains themselves are aware. The Appalachian Mountains run roughly 2,000 miles from Alabama in the south to Newfoundland in the north. They pass through 14 states. They are home to some of the oldest rural communities in the United States. They are covered in dense hardwood forest. They contain hollows, locals call them hollers, so deep and so isolated that some communities within them had almost no contact with the outside world until the 20th century. That isolation matters. It is part of why the stories survived. It is part of why the mysteries accumulated. When the outside world can't easily get in, the inside world develops its own logic, its own explanations, its own understanding of what is real. Let's start at the beginning. The age of the mountains, the Appalachians, are, by most geological estimates, somewhere between 300 million and 480 million years old. Take a moment with that number. 480 million years. That is a span of time so large that the human mind doesn't really process it as time at all. It becomes something more like a color, or a pressure, a sense of depth that words can gesture toward but never quite reach. To put it in some perspective, the Atlantic Ocean, which sits just to the east of the Appalachians, is approximately 180 million years old. That means the mountains were already ancient when the ocean beside them was born. The Appalachians watched the Atlantic form. They were standing, patient and worn, while the seafloor spread and the water filled in between continents that had once been pressed together. The dinosaurs, the ones that most of us picture when we think of ancient life, the great sauropods, the tyrannosaurs, they appeared roughly 230 million years ago. The Appalachians were already old when the first dinosaur took its first, and the Appalachians are still here, long after the last dinosaur is gone. This is the first thing to understand about this mountain range. It does not belong to human history. It barely belongs to the history of complex animal life on land. It belongs to something older than that, something that operates on timescales that make the entirety of human civilization, every empire, every city, every story we have ever told feel like an afternoon. How the mountains were built, the Appalachians, were not built all at once. They were built in layers, through a series of massive geological events that scientists call orogenies, mountain building episodes, caused by the collision of tectonic plates. The first of these was the Tectonic orogeny, which occurred roughly 440 to 480 million years ago. An ancient oceanic plate driving eastward collided with the edge of what would become North America. The force of that collision buckled the crust upward. Mountains rose where there had been a shallow sea. Then came the Akkadian orogeny, roughly 375 to 325 million years ago. Another collision, this time a microcontinent called Avalonia pressing in from the east. More compression, more folding. The mountains grew again, higher and more complex. And then the most dramatic event of all, the Alleghenian orogeny, approximately 320 to 290 million years ago. This was the collision that assembled the supercontinent Pangaea Africa, pressing into North America with a force that geologists describe as comparable to the forces currently building the Himalayas. The result was a mountain range that may have stood 20,000 feet tall, perhaps higher. Imagine that. A mountain range in what is now the American South and East, rising to heights comparable to the greatest peaks on Earth today. The climate of the region would have been utterly different. The air at those altitudes thin and cold, the peaks covered in ice and rock. And then the collisions stopped. Pangaea began to break apart. Africa pulled away from North America. The pressure that had been building the mountains was released, and the long, slow work of erosion began. The patient work of time erosion is not a dramatic process. It is not a single event. It is a relentless accumulation of small forces over incomprehensible spans of time. Rain falls on rock. Water finds cracks. It freezes, expands, and splits the rock apart, one winter at a time. Streams form, carrying sediment downhill. Rivers deepen their channels through bedrock, cutting downward, grain by grain, century by century. Ice sheets advance during cold periods and drag material across the landscape, planing surfaces smooth, carrying debris hundreds of miles from where it originated. For 200 million years or more, this is what happened to the Appalachians. The 20,000-foot peaks were taken apart. Their material washed down into river systems and eventually into the ocean, deposited as sediment that now forms the coastal plains of the eastern United States. What was once mountain is now flat land under cities. The substance of those ancient peaks is beneath our feet in places we would never think to look for it. What remained was what was hardest. The core material, the old crystalline rock granite and gneiss and schist that resisted erosion more stubbornly than the surrounding material. That resistance is what we see today when we look at the Appalachians. We are looking at the roots of a vanished giant. The highest point remaining in the American Appalachians is Mount Mitchell in North Carolina. It stands at 6,684. Beautiful, certainly, dramatic in its own right, covered in spruce and fir forest, often lost in cloud. But compared to what it once was, compared to the peak that stood on or near that location 300 million years ago, it is almost unrecognizably small. It is a foundation, a remnant, a memory in stone of something that no longer exists. Why this matters the age of the Appalachians is not merely a geological fact. It is context for everything that follows in this story. Because one of the threads that runs through virtually every Appalachian mystery, every theory, every legend, every account of something seen or heard or felt in those mountains is the idea that this is a place where things accumulate, where events leave residue, where the past does not entirely release its hold. Things have been happening in the Appalachians for so long, and the mountains have stood witness to so much, that the historical record, the one we have access to, the written one, the scientific one, simply cannot contain all of it. The record has gaps, large ones. The indigenous peoples who lived in the mountains for thousands of years before European contact left oral traditions that survived, but also knowledge that did not. The settlers who moved into the deep hollows lived in a degree of isolation that meant their experiences were rarely written down. The mountains themselves offer no commentary. What fills those gaps, inevitably, is and the stories that have attached themselves to the Appalachians over centuries have a particular quality to them. They feel, somehow, proportionate to the age of the place. They are not small stories. They are not simple ones. They carry the weight of something very old underneath them, even when the stories themselves are recent. That weight is where we are going next. The first people human beings have been living in the Appalachian region for at least 16,000 years, possibly longer. That number deserves a moment of stillness, too, 16,000 years. Agriculture, as a human practice, is only about 12,000 years old. Writing is only about 5,000 years old. The entirety of recorded history, every document, every inscription, every letter and chronicle and newspaper covers only the most recent fraction of the time that people have been walking through these mountains. Whatever the Appalachians know about human beings, they learned most of it before we started writing things down. The first arrivals, the earliest known inhabitants of the Appalachian region, were Paleo-Indian peoples, the descendants of the first populations to move into North America from the north and west, following the retreating edge of the glaciers as the last ice age loosened its grip on the continent. These were not primitive people in any meaningful sense of that word. They were sophisticated hunters and foragers who understood their environment in extraordinary detail. They knew the movement patterns of mastodons and giant ground sloths and horses animals that no longer exist. They knew which plants were edible and which were medicinal and which were dangerous. They navigated landscapes that looked nothing like the Appalachians we see today, landscapes that were colder, drier in some places and wetter in others, covered in vegetation types that have no modern equivalent. They left behind stone tools, carefully shaped points and blades that archaeologists find in the soil of the Appalachian foothills and valleys. They left behind fire pits, charcoal, the scattered bones of meals. In a handful of sites, they left behind burials, careful arrangements of the dead that suggest ceremony, belief, and a relationship with death that went beyond the purely practical. What they did not leave behind, at least not in forms we have recovered, is any substantial account of their experience. We know they were here. We know roughly when they were here. We know, from the tools and the bones, something about how they survived. But what they thought about the mountains they lived within, what stories they told, what fears they carried, what they believed about the places in the landscape that felt different from others, this is almost entirely lost. Almost because some of what those earliest people thought and believed was carried forward, in transformed and layered form, through the cultures that came after them. Thousands of years of deepening over the millennia that followed the first arrival. The populations of the Appalachian region did not stay static. They grew, diversified, traded, warred, merged, and split apart. New cultural traditions emerged. Old ones were absorbed into new ones. By roughly 3,000 years ago, the Appalachian region was part of a broader Eastern Woodlands cultural world that included sophisticated societies with extensive trade networks. Copper from the Great Lakes moved through exchange systems that reached the Gulf Coast. Shells from the Atlantic shore appeared in burial sites deep in the interior. Ceremonial objects and ideas moved across the continent in ways that archaeologists are still mapping. The Hopewell tradition, centered in the Ohio Valley, but extending its influence throughout the eastern woodlands, built elaborate earthworks and maintained mortuary practices of great complexity. Some of those earthworks are in or near the Appalachian region. They were built by people who understood engineering, astronomy, and the symbolic organization of landscape in ways that archaeologists have only recently begun to appreciate fully. This matters because one of the persistent threads in Appalachian mystery culture is the idea that the pre-Columbian history of the region is richer and stranger than the mainstream account acknowledges. The Hopewell earthworks alone, thousands of geometric enclosures, mounds aligned to astronomical events, sites connected across hundreds of miles, are evidence that the cultures of this region, long before European contact, were doing things that deserve more attention than they typically receive in popular history. The Cherokee and their mountains, by the time European explorers arrived in the 16th century, the southern Appalachians were the homeland of the Cherokee people, one of the largest and most complex native nations in eastern North America. The Cherokee did not think of themselves as living near the mountains, or beside them, or in spite of them. They thought of themselves as part of the mountains, and the mountains as part of them. This is not metaphor. It is a genuine ontological position, a way of understanding the relationship between people and place that does not separate them into foreground and background. Their name for their homeland, Chaconage, is most commonly translated as Land of the Blue Smoke, a reference to the natural haze that hangs over the southern Appalachians, produced by the volatile organic compounds released by the dense hardwood forest. That haze has a quality to it that anyone who has stood at a high point in the Smokies or the Blue Ridge will recognize. It is soft. It layers the ridges in gradations of blue and grey. It makes the mountains look, from a distance, like something breathing. The Cherokee noticed this. They named their home for it. And in doing so, they encoded a truth about the landscape that later arrivals would take much longer to appreciate, that the Appalachians are a living system, not a static backdrop. They exhale. They change with the light. They are, in a biological sense that science now confirms, constantly releasing something into the air. A landscape that watches Cherokee oral traditions are rich, complex, and not reducible to simple summary. But one thread that runs through many of them is the idea that the mountains are inhabited by presences that are not human, but are nonetheless aware. The Nunnehi are perhaps the most commonly discussed of these presences. They are described as an immortal spirit people who live inside the mountains and beneath the rivers. They are not ghosts. They are not demons. They are something else beings who exist in the same landscape as humans, but in a layer of it that is not normally visible. They are described as benevolent, generally, though also as capable of leading people astray if approached without the proper respect. There are accounts in Cherokee tradition of the Nunnehi appearing to people in times of great danger and leading them to safety. During the forced removal of the Cherokee in 1830, the event known as the Trail of Tears stories circulated of communities that had been protected, or hidden, by the Nunnehi. Of people who disappeared into the mountains and were not removed, because something in the mountains kept them. Whether one understands these accounts as literal, symbolic, or something in between. They point toward a relationship with the landscape that is fundamentally different from the European-American relationship. In the Cherokee understanding, the mountains are not resources to be extracted or territories to be mapped. They are presences to be respected, maintained in relationship with, and listened to. This idea that the landscape itself is responsive, that it has something like awareness, that the correct relationship to it is one of reciprocity rather than exploitation, is not unique to the Cherokee. It appears in the traditions of virtually every indigenous culture that has lived in the Appalachian region. It appears, in muted and transformed forms, in the folk beliefs of the Scots-Irish settlers who came later. It surfaces, again, in the accounts of modern people who have spent significant time in the deep backcountry of the mountains and come back saying that something there felt present. This is the idea that sits underneath all the specific theories and legends we will discuss tonight. Not as explanation, exactly, but as orientation. The mountains are not just old. They are not just interesting geology and complex history. They are, in the understanding of the people who have known them longest, something closer to a presence. And presences, unlike landscapes, can keep secrets. European arrival and the birth of Appalachian isolation, the first Europeans to see the southern Appalachians were not settlers. They were soldiers and adventurers, moving through a landscape they did not understand, looking for something they would not find. Hernando de Soto arrived in Florida in 1539 with an expedition of roughly 600 men. He was a veteran of the conquest of Peru. He had seen what gold could do for a man's reputation and fortune, and he intended to find more of it. His expedition moved northward and westward through the southeastern part of the continent over the following 3 years, cutting through territory that is now Georgia, South Carolina, North Carolina, Tennessee, Alabama, and beyond. In 1540, somewhere in the southern Appalachians, the exact route is still debated by historians. De Soto's expedition encountered the mountains for the first time. What he found was not gold. What he found was terrain. Dense, difficult, disorienting terrain. Ridges that folded into more ridges. Rivers that ran in unexpected directions. Forests so thick that visibility dropped to almost nothing. within a few feet of the trail. Cherokee towns, some of them substantial, whose inhabitants were sometimes cooperative and sometimes decidedly not. De Soto passed through. He didn't stay. He was looking for something the mountains didn't offer, at least not in any form he recognized. He moved on westward, and he died 2 years later on the banks of the Mississippi River, having found none of the gold he came for. But his expedition left something behind. Disease, primarily the catastrophic wave of epidemic illness that preceded European settlement proper and reshaped the indigenous populations of the Appalachian region in ways that the historical record only partially captures. By the time English settlers arrived in significant numbers, the landscape they encountered had already been changed by a century of epidemic and demographic collapse that most of them knew nothing about. The English push inland English colonists established their first permanent settlements on the Atlantic coast in the early 1600s. For decades, those settlements clung to the coastal plain. The mountains were visible from certain high points, a blue line on the western horizon, but they were remote, and the interior was largely unknown to European settlers. That began to change in the late 1600s. Explorers pushed through the gaps in the Blue Ridge. Traders followed river systems into the interior, making contact with native communities and establishing the exchange networks that would eventually become roads. By 1700, the map of the Appalachian interior was beginning to take shape in European minds. And then the settlers came. The Scots-Irish and the making of mountain culture the group most responsible for the cultural character of the deep Appalachians, the group whose descendants would define what later Americans came to think of as mountain people was not English. It was Scots-Irish. The Scots-Irish were a people shaped by centuries of displacement and hardship. Their roots were in the Scottish lowlands and the northern counties of England. In the 17th century, large numbers of them were transplanted to Ulster in Northern Ireland as part of the English colonial project. They lived there for several generations, maintaining a distinct identity Protestant, suspicious of authority, deeply clannish, and accustomed to surviving in marginal lands that other people had decided weren't worth fighting over. When economic and political conditions in Ulster deteriorated in the early 18th century, they left. Hundreds of thousands of them crossed the Atlantic between roughly 1718 and 1775. They arrived primarily in Pennsylvania and then, pushed by land pressure and a cultural preference for the frontier, moved southward and westward along the spine of the Appalachians, into the Shenandoah Valley, into the hollows of Western Virginia and North Carolina, into Kentucky and Tennessee. They were, by both temperament and experience, exceptionally well suited to the mountains. They were comfortable with isolation. They were skilled at subsistence farming and hunting. They were accustomed to building communities in places that larger power structures had largely ignored, and they were deeply, seriously, practically superstitious. This last point matters enormously for everything that follows. A worldview shaped by the old and the new the folk belief system that the Scots-Irish brought to the Appalachians was not a simple thing. It was a layered accumulation of ideas that had been building for centuries in the British Isles, a system that officially presented itself as Protestant Christianity, but that carried, just beneath its surface, a rich residue of pre-Christian belief. They believed in the evil eye, the capacity of certain people to cause harm through a glance, whether intentionally or not. They believed in the power of certain words and gestures to protect against harm. They believed in witches, not as theological abstractions, but as actual people in their communities who had made arrangements with forces that decent folk avoided. They believed in haints, spirits of the dead, who remained attached to specific places, and could make their presence known to the living. They believed, perhaps most importantly for our purposes, that the landscape itself was morally and spiritually differentiated, that some places were safe and some were not, that some locations carried a history that made them dangerous, or sacred, or both, that the correct response to certain features of the natural world, particular springs, particular crossroads. Particular caves was a combination of respect and avoidance. When this belief system entered the Appalachians and began to mix with the indigenous knowledge and tradition already present there, something happened that is genuinely remarkable in the history of American folk culture. The two systems were not identical, but they rhymed. The Cherokee understanding of the landscape as inhabited by presences the knew knee-high in the mountains, the water spirits in the rivers, the sacred significance of particular geographic features found resonance with the Scots-Irish understanding of a landscape populated by spirits and morally weighted places. The specific beings were different. The specific practices were different. But the underlying orientation, the sense that the natural world is not neutral, that it responds to human behavior, that certain places demand certain kinds of attention was shared. And so the folklore deepened. It didn't simply layer one tradition on top of another, it wove them together in ways that produced something new. A story about a particular river bend that was dangerous might carry elements of Cherokee water spirit tradition and Scots-Irish haint law simultaneously, neither cancelling the other out, both contributing to a shared community understanding that this place required care. The consequence of isolation, this blending, happened in isolation. That is crucial. Many Appalachian communities, particularly those in the deep hollows of West Virginia, eastern Kentucky, southwestern Virginia, and the Tennessee mountains, were extraordinarily cut off from the broader currents of American life well into the 20th century. There were no paved roads into some of these communities until the 1930s. Mail service was irregular. The outside world arrived slowly, when it arrived at all. In this isolation, the folklore did not dissolve. It concentrated. Stories that might have been diluted by contact with urban skepticism or by the homogenizing force of national media stayed local, stayed specific, stayed tied to particular places and particular families. A story about something that happened at a specific creek crossing in 1850 was still being told, still being believed, still shaping the behavior of the community near that creek 100 years later. This is the soil from which Appalachian conspiracy and mystery grew. Not just imagination, not just fear of the dark, but centuries of accumulated, places-specific, cross-cultural knowledge about a landscape that genuinely unusual things seem to happen in. A living archive maintained in oral tradition of encounters and events and warnings that the written historical record never captured. That archive is what we are drawing from tonight, and we are only just beginning to open it. Why the stories survived isolation is the most important word in understanding Appalachian folklore and mystery culture. Many communities in the deep Appalachians had almost no reliable road access until the 1930s and 1940s. The New Deal era programs that built roads and bridges into isolated communities were, for many of those communities, the first sustained contact they had with the broader American economy and culture. Before that, the mountains were not merely remote. They were, in practical terms, a world unto themselves. In some of the deepest hollows in Kentucky, West Virginia, Virginia, and Tennessee, communities functioned almost entirely on their own logic. They had their own economy barter-based, hyperlocal, built around what the land could provide and what neighbors could trade. They had their own medicine, a sophisticated body of herbal and ritual knowledge passed down through family lines, maintained by women who served as healers, midwives, and the keepers of remedies that had no written form. They had their own justice, settled between families and communities, without reference to courts or sheriffs who were, in any case, too far away to matter. And they had their own explanations for the world explanations that the outside culture, when it eventually arrived, would call superstition. But that functioned, inside those communities, as something more like science, a tested, practical, socially maintained understanding of how things worked and what happened when you ignored the rules. Stories didn't just survive in these communities. They were essential infrastructure. Think about what a story actually does in a community, without books, without signage, without the institutional memory that written records provide. It carries information. It encodes warning. It maps the landscape in terms of what is safe and what is not. If a child wandered too close to a particular cave and something happened to them if they came back changed, or didn't come back at all, the story of that cave became a boundary marker, passed down through generations, embellished perhaps in the way that oral transmission always embroiders, but passed down with its essential warning intact. Don't go there. Something lives there. Something happened there once. If a family encountered something in the woods, they couldn't explain a sound, a shape, a feeling of being watched by something that didn't move like any animal they knew. They told the story. And the story became part of the community's shared map of the landscape, another data point in a body of local knowledge that was taken together. A remarkably detailed account of a very specific place over a very long period of time. When researchers and folklorists began moving through the Appalachians in earnest in the early 20th century, people like Olive Dame Campbell, who collected songs and stories in the mountains of North Carolina and Kentucky, and John Jacob Niles, who preserved ballads that traced their roots to the British Isles. And later the collectors of the Federal Writers Project, who fanned out across the region in the 1930s, recording the accounts of ordinary people. They found something that surprised many of them. They found a region absolutely saturated with stories. Stories about creatures seen at the edge of the tree line, about disappearances that the community had its own explanation for. An explanation that differed markedly from anything the county sheriff had written down. About lights above certain ridges, about particular hollows where livestock behaved strangely and compasses gave wrong readings. About encounters with people or things that appeared to be people who didn't quite seem right on closer inspection. Some of those stories, when the researchers traced them carefully, turned out to be very old, older than the communities telling them, older in some cases than European settlement in the region at all. The isolation hadn't created the mysteries, it had preserved them. When people started asking larger questions, the modern era of Appalachian conspiracy thinking is generally traced to the 1960s and 70s, when a broader American culture of government skepticism, environmental concern, and paranormal interest intersected with the Appalachian region in particularly potent ways. This was not a quiet period in American history. Trust in institutions was beginning to fracture. The Vietnam War was unfolding on television screens, the civil rights movement had exposed deep structural injustices, and for many Americans, the idea that official explanations might be incomplete or deliberately misleading was becoming easier to accept. In the Appalachians, that shift did not arrive as something new. It arrived as confirmation of something people already felt. Several things happened around this time that fed into the mythology. The Army Corps of Engineers began flooding large sections of Appalachian valleys to create reservoirs. Projects like Norris Lake in Tennessee, Summersville Lake in West Virginia, and Lake Fontana in North Carolina required the clearing and submerging of entire communities. Houses were dismantled or abandoned, churches were relocated, cemeteries were dug up and moved, though not always completely. Roads disappeared beneath rising water for the people who had lived in those valleys. This was not an abstract infrastructure project, it was the erasure of place. And when the water levels dropped during drought years, the past came back into view. Foundations, stone walls, the outlines of roads, in some cases, objects that seemed out of place, structures or fragments that didn't match the official history of what had been there. Most of these could be explained with careful study. Some were simply old in ways that made people uncomfortable. The landscape itself began to feel layered in a new way, not just old, but submerged, not just remembered, but physically present beneath the surface. At the same time, coal mining along the economic backbone of central Appalachia was entering a visible period of strain. Strip mining operations were carving away entire sections of mountains. Forests were cleared, streams were polluted. The land in some areas began to look less like a place people lived and more like a place something had been taken from. Communities that had already lived for generations with economic hardship began to feel something sharper, a sense that decisions about their land were being made far away, by people who would never have to live with the consequence. That sense fed into a broader distrust of government agencies and corporate power, a distrust that was not theoretical, but rooted in lived experience. And distrust, once established, changes the way people interpret what they see. When something unusual happened, a strange light in the sky, an animal that didn't quite match anything familiar, a sound in the woods that had no clear source, it was no longer automatically dismissed. It was considered, discussed, sometimes recorded. And then there were the sightings. Throughout the 1960s and 70s, reports of strange creatures, unexplained aerial phenomena, and unusual encounters in the Appalachian backcountry began appearing with increasing frequency. Local newspapers ran small columns about things seen at the edge of towns. Amateur investigators began corresponding with each other, comparing notes across state lines. Stories that might once have stayed within a single hollow began to travel. Some of those stories reached a national audience. Books were published. Radio programs discussed. The Appalachians, long treated as isolated, began to appear in the broader American imagination as a place where unusual things seemed to happen with unusual consistency. And yet, for the people who lived there, this did not feel like something new. It felt like something that had always been there, finally being noticed. The Appalachians, it seemed, had not finished telling their stories. The famous theory. The Lost Cherokee Tunnels, one of the most persistent and widely repeated theories about the Appalachians, is the claim that beneath the mountains there exists an ancient network of tunnels. It is the kind of idea that settles easily into the imagination. Not dramatic, not loud, just a quiet possibility. That beneath the forest floor, beneath the roots of trees and the slow movement of streams, there are spaces. Passages, openings that connect one place to another in ways that are not visible from above. The theory takes several different forms depending on who is telling it, but the most common version goes something like this. The Cherokee, and possibly the peoples who came before them, constructed or discovered a system of underground passages running through the bedrock of the southern Appalachians. These tunnels served different purposes in different tellings. In some versions, they were practical, used for movement between valleys without exposure, for trade routes hidden from enemies, for shelter during times of conflict. In other versions, they were ceremonial sacred pathways, connecting important sites, used for rituals that required separation from the surface world. And in still other versions, they were protective places where important objects, or even entire communities, could be hidden from approaching danger. Like many enduring theories, this one draws its strength from things that are undeniably real. The Appalachian region is filled with caves. Much of the southern Appalachians sits on karst limestone, a type of rock that dissolves slowly in slightly acidic water. Over long periods of time, this process creates voids, first small cracks, then larger openings, then entire cave systems that can extend for miles beneath the surface. Some of these caves are well documented and mapped, others are only partially explored, and some are known only to local communities, their entrances unmarked, their interiors largely untouched. When you stand at the mouth of one of these caves, the theory becomes easier to understand. The air changes, it becomes cooler. Stiller, sound behaves differently. Light falls away very quickly, even in the middle of the day. And there is a sense difficult to describe precisely that the space continues far beyond what you can see, that the darkness is not just absence, but depth. Proponents of the tunnel theory often point to these caves as evidence that a larger system could exist, not necessarily carved entirely by human hands, but discovered, modified, connected over time. A natural network, shaped and adapted for human use. They also point to Cherokee oral traditions. In those traditions, there are repeated references to underground places. Not simply caves in the practical sense, but spaces beneath the earth that carry spiritual significance. Places where certain beings live. Places that function as thresholds, points of transition between one state of being and another. The Nunnihi, often described as spirit people who dwell inside the mountains, are frequently associated with these spaces. They are said to live in towns beneath the ground, to move through the mountains in ways that humans cannot see, and to emerge at certain locations under specific conditions. These accounts are not presented within the tradition as metaphor in the modern literary sense. They are presented as part of a lived understanding of the world one, in which the visible surface is only one layer of a more complex structure. There are also the early European accounts. Explorers and settlers moving into the Appalachian interior in the 17th and 18th centuries occasionally recorded encounters with openings in the earth that their indigenous guides treated with caution. There are scattered journal entries describing caves that were avoided, entrances that were pointed out but not approached, places where guides refused to continue. These accounts are fragmentary. They are filtered through translation, through cultural misunderstanding, through the tendency of early explorers to misinterpret what they were being told. But they exist, and they are often cited as supporting evidence that certain underground spaces held significance beyond their physical form. The Nikwasi Mound, located in present-day Franklin, North Carolina, is frequently brought into this discussion. It is a real place, a large, carefully constructed earthen mound built by the Cherokee, used for ceremonial and civic purposes. It has been part of the historical record for centuries, and it remains significant to Cherokee people today. According to certain Cherokee traditions, the mound is associated with the Nunnehi. It is described as a place where they dwell, or where they can be encountered, a place where the boundary between the surface world and the world beneath is thinner. In some modern interpretations of the tunnel theory, Nikwasi becomes more than a ceremonial site. It becomes a node, one point, in a larger network of connected locations across the southern Appalachians. Other mounds, other caves, other geographic features are added to this network, forming a kind of hidden map beneath the visible one. This is where the theory begins to expand beyond its original scope. In its more developed form, it suggests not just isolated tunnels or sacred caves, but a coordinated system and underground geography that mirrors the above-ground landscape of rivers, ridges, and settlements. A system that was known to indigenous peoples, perhaps used by them, and then gradually lost or concealed over time. Mainstream archaeology, however, approaches this idea very differently. Extensive excavation and survey work in the Appalachian region has not produced evidence of artificial tunnel systems on the scale described in these theories. The caves that exist are, as far as current evidence shows, natural formations. While some caves show signs of human use artifacts, fire remains, modifications near entrances there is no confirmed evidence of larger scale excavation or construction connecting these spaces into a unified network. Cherokee scholars and cultural experts also tend to interpret the oral traditions about underground places in a spiritual and cosmological context rather than a literal physical one. The underworld in many indigenous traditions is not simply a location beneath the ground, but a realm of meaning, a different layer of existence that interacts with the human world in symbolic and experiential ways. And yet, the theory persists. Part of that persistence comes from the nature of the landscape itself. The Appalachian cave systems are genuinely vast. New passages are still being discovered. Entire sections remain unmapped. The idea that something could exist beneath the mountains without being fully documented is not, on its face, impossible. But there is another reason the theory endures. It speaks to something deeper than geology. The idea that beneath a familiar landscape there is another version of that landscape, older, hidden, connected in ways we no longer understand, is a powerful one. It suggests continuity. It suggests that knowledge once existed that has since been lost. It suggests that the mountains are not just what they appear to be on the surface, but something layered, something with interior space both physical and symbolic. Whether or not there are tunnels beneath the Appalachians in the way the theory describes, the feeling that gives rise to the theory is real. the sense that there is more to the mountains than what can be seen from the outside. And that sense, like many others we will encounter tonight, is not easily dismissed. Bigfoot in the mountains there is probably no Appalachian mystery better known outside the region than the persistent reports of a large, bipedal, hair-covered creature living in the forests of the mountains. It is a simple idea, on the surface, something large, something that walks like a person but is not a person, something that stays just far enough out of sight that it is never fully confirmed, but never fully dismissed either. In the Appalachians, this creature goes by many names. Bigfoot is the most widely recognized, a name borrowed from reports in the Pacific Northwest. But in the hills and hollows of West Virginia and Kentucky, people often call it the wood bugger, a name that sounds almost playful until you hear the way it is used in context. In other places, it is simply the wild man, spoken without elaboration, as if no further description is necessary. In older layers of folklore, there are connections drawn to the Cherokee figure known as Nu-Nu-Nu-Wee, the Stone Man, a being associated with strength, danger, and the deep interior of the forest. Different names, different emphases, but the same underlying shape. The Appalachian reports share a set of characteristics that has remained remarkably consistent over time. The creature is described as very tall typically, between 7 and 9 feet. Its body is covered in hair, most often described as dark brown, sometimes reddish, occasionally black. It walks upright, with a stride that witnesses often describe as unnaturally smooth for something of its size. There is frequently a smell associated with it strong, unpleasant, difficult to play. Something between wet earth, decay, and animal musk. It is rarely seen clearly. Most encounters happen at a distance, or in low light, or at the edge of visibility just beyond where details become certain. A figure crossing a logging road at night. A shape standing between trees at dusk. A movement near a riverbank that resolves, for a moment, into something that looks back. And then is gone. Reports from the Appalachians are not new. In the 19th century, local newspapers across the mountains south occasionally printed accounts of encounters with what they called wild men or hairy giants. These accounts were usually brief. A farmer reporting something seen near his property. A hunter describing tracks found in soft ground footprints that were too large, too human-shaped, to match any known animal in the region. These early reports lack the shared terminology that would come later. There was no unified concept of Bigfoot yet. But the descriptions, when read together, form a pattern that is difficult to ignore. Something was being seen, or thought to be seen, something that didn't fit neatly into the categories available at the time. Hunters, in particular, appear frequently in these accounts. People who spent long hours alone in the forest. People who knew the behavior of animals, the sounds they made, the tracks they left behind. When those people reported something they couldn't identify, it carried a certain weight within their communities. Not proof, exactly, but not easily dismissed either. In the modern era, the reports have become more numerous and more geographically clustered. The New River Gorge area of West Virginia is often cited as a hotspot. The terrain there is steep and heavily forested, cut by deep river channels that limit access and visibility. The Cherokee National Forest in Tennessee, with its vast stretches of contiguous woodland, generates regular reports. The Daniel Boone National Forest in Kentucky, another region of dense forest and rugged topography, appears frequently in modern sighting databases. These are places where it is still possible to be alone for long periods of time. Places where visibility is limited, where sound carries in unusual ways, where distances are difficult to judge. Places where, if something large were moving through the forest, it could remain unseen for longer than one might expect. The standard question, the one most often asked outside the region, is whether a large, undiscovered primate could exist in North America. And in the Appalachians, that question is sometimes answered differently. There are researchers, and more often. There are long-time residents who are less interested in classifying the creature biologically, and more interested in describing the experience of encountering it. Those descriptions often include elements that go beyond the visual. A sudden silence in the forest, as if all background noise has stopped at once. A feeling of being watched that arrives before anything is seen. A sense of pressure or unease that seems disproportionate to the situation. Electronic equipment behaving erratically, cameras failing, batteries draining faster than expected. In some accounts, a distortion of time, a sense that more time has passed than should have, or less. These details are not present in every report, but they appear often enough, and consistently enough, that a subset of Appalachian Bigfoot research has taken them seriously. In this interpretation, the creature is not simply an undiscovered animal. It is something that exists at the edge of perception, something that may not be entirely physical in the way we understand physical things, something that appears, interacts, and then disappears in ways that do not leave behind the kind of evidence that would resolve the question definitively. This is, to put it gently, a more unusual theory. It moves the discussion out of biology and into something harder to define, something closer to the broader category of Appalachian anomaly, the place where creature sightings, light phenomena, and other unexplained experiences begin to overlap. We will return to that idea later. For now, it is enough to sit with the simpler version. For over 200 years, people in the Appalachian Mountains have been reporting encounters with something large, upright, and not easily explained. The descriptions are consistent across time and geography. The witnesses include people with no apparent reason to fabricate their accounts, and in many cases, a strong incentive not to speak about them at all. Whether one believes those reports or not, the pattern they form is difficult to dismiss entirely. Something is being seen in those forests, and whatever it has been there, or at least in the stories, for a very long time. The disappearances of the Appalachian Trail runs approximately 2,190 miles from Springer Mountain in Georgia to Mount Katahdin in Maine. It passes through 14 states. It crosses national parks, state forests, private land, ridgelines, river valleys, and long stretches of wilderness where the nearest road may be hours away on foot. At any given time during the hiking season, thousands of people are on it. Some are day hikers, walking a few miles before turning back. Some are section hikers, completing the trail in pieces over months or years. And some are through hikers, attempting to walk the entire length in a single continuous journey that can take 5 to 7 months. It is, in many ways, one of the most traveled wilderness routes in the world. And still, people disappear from it. On its own, that fact is not especially unusual. Wilderness areas, by their nature, are places where things can go wrong quickly. A wrong turn at a poorly marked junction, a sudden change in weather, an injury miles from help, dehydration, hypothermia, simple exhaustion. These are enough to explain most cases of missing hikers, but not all of them. Over the past several decades, a number of researchers have suggested that the pattern of disappearances in and around the Appalachian Trail, and more broadly, in the Appalachian wilderness, contains elements that are difficult to explain through conventional means alone. The most well-known of these researchers is David Paulides, a former police detective who has compiled and written about hundreds of missing persons cases in national parks and remote areas across North America. His work focuses on identifying patterns, similarities between cases that, taken individually, might appear isolated, but when viewed together begin to suggest something more structured. The Appalachian cases, in his analysis, are part of that pattern. The cases that receive the most attention tend to share a set of recurring features. A person goes missing in conditions that seem, on the surface, relatively safe. Clear weather, familiar trail, daylight. In some cases, the individual is experienced someone who knows the terrain, who has navigated similar environments before without difficulty. Then, they are gone. Search and rescue operations begin quickly, often within hours. In heavily trafficked areas of the trail, This can involve dozens or even hundreds of people, trained teams, volunteers, dogs, helicopters. The search areas are mapped, grids are assigned, terrain is covered methodically. And yet, in certain cases, nothing is found. No clear trail of movement, no discarded equipment, no sign of struggle, just absence. In some instances, the missing person is eventually located, but the circumstances of that discovery introduce new questions rather than resolving the old ones. They are found in locations that do not align with the expected path of travel, higher up a mountain when they had been heading downhill, farther away from the trail than their condition would seem to allow, in areas that had already been searched, sometimes more than once. There are accounts of individuals being found without shoes, despite rough terrain, of clothing removed or arranged in unusual ways, of people surviving for days in conditions that should have been fatal, and unable to explain how they got where they were found. And then there are the cases where no one is found at all. The Great Smoky Mountains National Park appears frequently in these discussions. It is one of the most visited national parks in the United States, drawing millions of visitors each year. It is also one of the most geographically complex, a dense, folded landscape of ridges and valleys, with thick forest cover that can reduce visibility to just a few yards in some areas. From a practical standpoint, it is easy to see how someone could become lost there. And yet, certain cases stand out. Children who disappear within minutes and are later found miles away, sometimes at elevations or across terrain that would be difficult for an adult to traverse quickly, let alone a child. Experienced hikers who leave the trail briefly and never return. Individuals who vanish near water, sources a pattern that appears often enough to be noted, though not fully explained. Park authorities and search professionals offer grounded explanations for these events. Disorientation can happen quickly in dense forest. Panic can lead people to make irrational decisions. Children, when frightened, can move unpredictably and cover surprising distances. The terrain itself steep, uneven, filled with natural obstacles, can conceal a person even from a close search. These explanations account for many cases, but not all of them feel fully resolved. And it is in that gap between explanation and lingering uncertainty that the theories begin to form. Proponents of the idea that something unusual is happening in these disappearances are often careful in how they present it. They do not always claim a specific cause. Instead, they point to the pattern itself. They describe the similarities, the repeated elements, the sense that certain kinds of cases occur again and again under similar conditions. What that pattern means is left open. Some suggest a human explanation the possibility of individuals or groups operating in remote areas, taking advantage of isolation and limited oversight. This is difficult to prove and equally difficult to fully dismiss. Others suggest environmental or geophysical factors, not yet fully understood areas where navigation behaves unpredictably, where sensory perception is altered, where people become disoriented in ways that go beyond simple error. And then there are those who suggest something less easily categorized. Not necessarily a creature, not necessarily a person, but something about the wilderness itself, certain places, certain conditions where the usual rules seem to shift slightly, where people step, briefly, out of alignment with the world they expect to be in. That idea is rarely stated directly. It is implied more often than spoken. For many people, the most honest position is simply to acknowledge the uncertainty. People disappear in the Appalachian wilderness. Most are found, some are not. A small number of cases resist clean explanation even after careful investigation. The mountains do not offer answers. They hold what they hold. And for those who walk their trails, there is always, quietly, the understanding that stepping into the wilderness is also stepping into something that does not entirely belong to us, something that has its own logic, its own scale, and its own way of keeping what it chooses to keep. The Melungeons there is a population of people in the southern Appalachians, concentrated primarily in the Clinch Mountain area of Tennessee and Virginia, who have been the subject of speculation, study, and theory for well over a century. They are called the Melungeons. The word itself has an uncertain origin. Some suggest it comes from the French mélange, meaning mixture. Others trace it to older terms used in the Iberian Peninsula or the Ottoman world. Even the name, before anything else, carries that sense of ambiguity, a label applied from the outside, describing something that didn't fit neatly into the categories available at the time. The Melungeons are a mixed heritage group of people whose ancestry has been debated for generations. Early written accounts, dating to the late 18th and early 19th centuries, describe them as a population already established in the mountains before the main wave of Scots-Irish settlement. They appear in tax records, in court documents, in land transactions present, recognized, but not clearly understood by the officials recording them. When asked about their origins, different answers were given. Some families claimed Portuguese ancestry, others suggested Turkish roots. Some offered no explanation at all, or simply said they had been there for as long as anyone could remember. To their neighbours, they appeared different. They often had darker complexions than the surrounding white population. Their facial features did not always align with what local communities expected. They spoke English, but sometimes with distinct turns of phrase, traces of something older or external embedded in their speech. They lived in relatively isolated clusters, often marrying within their own communities, maintaining a degree of separation that was partly chosen and partly enforced. And because of all of this, they became the subject of enormous speculation. Much of that speculation, especially in the 19th century, was shaped by the rigid racial categories of the time. American society, particularly in the South, operated on systems that demanded clear classification, white or black, free or enslaved. A community that did not fit cleanly into those categories created discomfort, and that discomfort often turned into myth. Some theories were relatively sympathetic, or at least neutral in tone. There were claims that the Melungeons were the descendants of Portuguese explorers who had arrived on the American coast before the English and had moved inland, intermarrying with Native American populations. There were suggestions that they were remnants of the lost colony of Roanoke, the English settlement that disappeared in the late 16th century, leaving behind only the word Croatoan carved into a post. Other theories reached further. Some claimed North African or Middle Eastern origins, that the Melungeons were descended from Moorish sailors, or Ottoman traders, or survivors of shipwrecks who had made their way inland and established isolated communities in the mountains. These ideas were often presented with little evidence, but they persisted, in part because they offered an explanation for difference that did not fit within the American racial binary. And then there were the less charitable theories. The Melungeons were sometimes described in official records and local gossip as degenerate or mixed blood in ways that carried heavy stigma. Laws were passed in some areas that restricted their rights, their ability to own land, to vote, to marry outside their community. They were, in many cases, treated as a problem to be categorized rather than a community to be understood. This is where the story begins to take on its deeper dimension. Because for a long time, the mystery of the Melungeons was not just about who they were. It was about why no one seemed willing to accept a straightforward answer. Modern genetic research has brought some clarity. A 2012 Dinar study examining individuals who identified as Melungeon found that their ancestry was primarily a combination of sub-Saharan African and European, with some Native American contribution. This suggests that the founding populations were likely groups of free black people and white individuals who moved into the Appalachian interior during the colonial period, seeking to escape the increasingly rigid and restrictive racial laws of the lowland South. In the mountains, where oversight was limited and communities were small, it was possible for a time to exist outside those categories, to form families and communities that would not have been permitted elsewhere. A subsequent, broader set of genetic studies has supported this general conclusion, while also indicating that the ancestry is complex, with multiple lines contributing over time. There is no single origin point, no single migration that explains everything. Instead, there is accumulation. Families coming together over generations, moving into the mountains, staying there, becoming, over time, a distinct community shaped by both choice and circumstance. The conspiracy dimension of the Melungeon story operates on several levels. At one level, it is a story about erasure. A community existed that did not fit into the official categories of American society. Rather than adjusting those categories, the broader culture attempted to explain the community away, to label it, to mythologize it, to place it somewhere that made it less disruptive to the existing structure. In this sense, the mystery of the Melungeons says more about the society observing them than about the people themselves. At another level, the story has been pulled into the wider web of Appalachian conspiracy and alternative history. The idea that the Melungeons represent the descendants of pre-Columbian explorers, Portuguese, Phoenician, or otherwise, continues to circulate. It appears in books, in online discussions, in speculative histories that attempt to rewrite the timeline of contact between the Old World and the New. These theories persist, despite the lack of strong archaeological or genetic evidence supporting them. They endure because they offer something compelling. They suggest that history is incomplete, that there are chapters missing from the official narrative, that hidden lineages and forgotten journeys might still be visible if you know where to look. But even without those speculative layers, the story of the Melungeons remains deeply significant. It is a story about people who found a way to exist between categories, about how isolation can create space for new identities to form, about how communities protect themselves, sometimes by staying hidden, sometimes by adapting, sometimes by allowing the outside world to misunderstand them rather than forcing a confrontation. And it is a story about how mystery can be created not by the absence of information, but by the refusal to accept what is already there. The Melungeons are not a myth. They are a community, a history, a living reminder that the boundaries we draw between races, between cultures, between what is known and what is allowed to be known are often less stable than we pretend. And in the mountains, where those boundaries have always been a little softer, their story found a place to endure. The Brown Mountain lights in the foothills of the Blue Ridge Mountains in Burke County, North Carolina. There is a ridge called Brown Mountain. It is not the tallest ridge in the region. It does not stand out dramatically from the others that surround it. By day, it looks much like any other Appalachian ridge tree, covered, softly contoured, part of the long, layered horizon that defines the landscape. And yet, when night falls, something changes. Above Brown Mountain, people have been seeing lights for a very long time. They do not appear every night. They are not guaranteed. But when conditions are right clear air, the right vantage point, a patient observer, they sometimes emerge. The descriptions are remarkably consistent. Small glowing orbs of light appear above the ridgeline, sometimes low, hovering just above the tree line, sometimes higher, drifting upward before fading out. They are usually round or close enough to round that witnesses describe them that way. Their color varies white, amber, red, occasionally blue, though many accounts describe a warm, soft glow rather than a sharp or artificial light. They move, slowly, most often. A drifting motion, a rise, a pause, a descent. Sometimes they split into multiple lights. Sometimes they appear, disappear, and then reappear in a slightly different position, as if moving through space in a way that does not follow a straight path. They are silent, and they are only visible at night. The first written account of the Brown Mountain Lights dates to 1871 in a letter published in a North Carolina newspaper. The writer described seeing mysterious lights hovering above the mountain, lights that could not be explained by any known source at the time. But the written record is not the beginning of the story. Cherokee oral traditions describe lights in the same area long before European settlement. In these accounts, the lights are not an unexplained curiosity. They are understood. They are given meaning. One commonly shared story speaks of a battle that took place near Brown Mountain in the distant past. After the battle, the women of the community searched the mountains for their husbands and sons who had not returned. They carried torches. They moved through the darkness, calling out, looking for the lost. According to the tradition, the lights seen today are those torches. Still searching. This is not presented as metaphor within the tradition. It is presented as explanation, a continuity between past and present, where the events of long ago remain active in the landscape. Over the years, the lights have drawn attention from outside the region as well. The United States Geological Survey conducted formal investigations in 1913 and again in 1922. Their goal was straightforward: determine whether the lights could be explained by known physical phenomena. The initial conclusion was that the lights were caused by locomotive headlights from trains traveling in the distance, their beams refracted by atmospheric conditions and appearing to hover above the mountain. Later, as automobiles became more common, the explanation shifted to car headlights. And then, more generally, to atmospheric refraction, the bending of light from distant sources, distorted by layers of air at different temperatures. These explanations have some merit. Under certain conditions, light can behave in unusual ways. Distant sources can appear closer, elevated, or displaced. Temperature inversions can create optical effects that are surprising if you are not expecting them. But the explanations were not universally accepted. One reason is timing. Accounts of the Brown Mountain lights exist from before railroads reached the area, before automobiles were present. If the lights were seen in essentially the same form before those technologies existed, then those technologies cannot fully explain them. Another reason is behavior. Witnesses who have observed the lights closely often describe movement patterns that do not align well with distant, fixed light sources. The lights do not always move in straight lines. They do not always maintain consistent brightness. They sometimes appear in locations where no road or rail line exists, even at a distance. And so, alternative explanations have continued to develop. The most widely discussed scientific explanation today involves what are called Earth lights. Earth lights are a class of luminous phenomena associated with geological activity. In certain conditions, stress in the Earth's crust, particularly along fault lines, can generate electrical charges. These charges can, under specific circumstances, ionize air and produce visible light. This phenomenon has been studied in other parts of the world, most notably in Hessdalen, Norway, where similar lights have been observed and recorded over decades. The Hessdalen lights have been linked, at least in part, to a combination of geological and atmospheric factors that create stable, glowing orbs. The Appalachian region is not geologically inactive. There are ancient faults running through the mountains. The bedrock is under constant, slow stress. Some researchers have proposed that the Brown Mountain lights may be a localized expression of this kind of geophysical activity, a natural process that produces light under conditions we do not yet fully understand. In paranormal circles, the interpretation moves in a different direction. The lights are sometimes described as unidentified aerial phenomena objects, under some form of control, moving with purpose rather than drifting randomly. In other interpretations, they are seen as something more tied to the place itself, not visitors, but manifestations. A kind of energy that the mountain produces, visible under certain conditions, interacting with observers in subtle ways. There are also accounts quieter, less widely circulated, of people who have attempted to approach the lights. In some of these accounts, the lights recede as the observer moves closer, maintaining a distance that cannot quite be closed. In others, the lights disappear entirely when approached directly, only to reappear later when viewed from a distance again. This behavior, whether real or perceived, reinforces the sense that the lights are not easily pinned down. They are seen best from afar. They resist direct examination. And still, they continue. Today, there is a designated viewing area of Highway 181 in Burke County. People come with cameras, with binoculars, with quiet curiosity. Some nights, nothing happens. The ridge remains dark, indistinguishable from the others. But on certain nights, under certain conditions, the lights appear. They rise above the trees, they drift, they pause, they fade, and then they are gone. No single explanation has fully settled the question. The lights remain observed, recorded, debated, and, in some sense, still belonging more to the mountain than to any theory about them. They are one of the clearest examples in the Appalachians of something that is consistently seen, consistently described, and still not entirely understood. A quiet phenomenon, patient, returning night after night, for as long as anyone has been watching. The deep and fringe theories. The Appalachians as a pre-Columbian contact point, this is where things get considerably stranger. Up to this point, most of what we've discussed has at least some grounding in local tradition, observed phenomena, or documented historical ambiguity. But here, the conversation begins to stretch outward across oceans, across centuries, into the idea that the Appalachian Mountains may have been known long before they were supposed to be. There is a persistent and enthusiastic fringe research tradition that argues the Appalachians were not simply discovered by Europeans in the modern era, but visited repeatedly by ancient Old World civilizations. Not once, not accidentally, but as part of a pattern. In these theories, the mountains become more than a geographic feature. They become a destination, or at least a landmark, something recognizable from afar, something that could guide travelers across vast distances. The list of proposed visitors is long. Phoenician sailors, known for their maritime skill and extensive trade networks across the Mediterranean, are often placed at the center of these claims. Ancient Hebrews are sometimes included, connected through interpretations of certain inscriptions and symbolic parallels. Egyptian expeditions appear in some versions of the theory, usually tied to the idea of transoceanic navigation far earlier than commonly accepted. Irish monks, particularly those associated with the figure of St. Brendan, are said in some traditions to have travelled westward across the Atlantic in small boats. And Welsh settlers most famously connected to the legend of Prince Madoc in the 12th century are often cited as possible founders of early Appalachian communities. Each of these claims draws from a mixture of historical possibility and interpretive expansion. The evidence cited typically falls into a few recurring categories. One of the most frequently discussed is inscriptions. Throughout the Appalachian region, there are markings on rocks carvings, scratches, patterns that some researchers interpret as ancient writing. These markings are said to resemble Semitic scripts, or Occam Early Irish alphabet, composed of straight lines along a central axis, or other Old World writing systems. To those who support the theory, these inscriptions are direct evidence. Messages left behind by travelers who reached the continent long before Columbus. To linguists and archaeologists, however, these interpretations are not convincing. Most of the markings can be explained as natural weathering patterns, random scratches, or more recent carvings made by settlers. When examined systematically, they do not form consistent or translatable language structures. And yet, the idea persists. Because once you see a pattern that resembles writing, it is difficult to unsee it. There are also oral traditions. Some researchers point to stories within Native American traditions that they interpret as references to encounters with outsiders, people arriving from distant lands, bringing unfamiliar tools or knowledge. These interpretations are highly contested. Indigenous scholars often emphasize that these stories are being read out of context, or reshaped to fit narratives that were not originally present. But the presence of long, complex, oral traditions that contain layers of meaning and memory leaves space for interpretation. And that space is where these theories tend to grow. Then there are the structures. The most well-known site associated with this theory is Mystery Hill in New Hampshire, sometimes called America's Stonehenge. It sits at the northern end of the Appalachian Range and consists of a series of stone chambers, walls, and alignments that some researchers argue are astronomically significant. According to proponents, the site shows evidence of intentional design aligned with solstices and equinoxes, suggesting a level of astronomical knowledge consistent with ancient European or Mediterranean cultures. Mainstream archaeology offers a different explanation. The structures are generally attributed to colonial-era construction, possibly farm buildings, root cellars, or other utilitarian uses, combined with natural rock formations. The astronomical alignments, in this view, are either coincidental or the result of selective interpretation. Within the central and southern Appalachians, similar debates surround the so-called stone chambers. These are small, dome-shaped structures built into hillsides, constructed from fitted stone without mortar. They appear in parts of Virginia, West Virginia, Tennessee, and beyond. To most historians, they are root cellars' practical storage spaces used by early settlers to keep food cool and protected. But to those inclined toward alternative explanations, the chambers raise questions. Why are some of them aligned in particular directions? Why do certain construction techniques resemble those found in parts of Europe? Why do they appear in clusters in some regions and in isolation in others? These questions do not necessarily imply ancient origin, but they create just enough uncertainty to keep the discussion alive. There is also the matter of names. Some researchers have argued that certain Appalachian place names bear phonetic resemblance to words from Old World languages Hebrew, Gaelic, Phoenician, rivers, mountains, valleys, that, when spoken aloud, seem to echo sounds from distant cultures. Linguists, for the most part, do not accept this line of reasoning. Language evolves in complex, traceable ways, and superficial similarity is not sufficient evidence of connection. But the human mind is very good at finding patterns, especially when those patterns suggest a hidden continuity between distant places and times. And that may be the key to why this theory endures, because it attaches itself to something that is real. The Appalachian region does have a deep and complex pre-Columbian history. The mound-building cultures of the eastern United States, the Hopewell, the Adena, the Mississippian, created vast earthworks, maintained long-distance trade networks, and developed social systems that are still not fully understood. There are sites that have not been fully excavated, artifacts that have not been fully explained, entire regions where archaeological work has been limited by terrain, funding, or historical circumstance. There are gaps, and where there are gaps, theories take root. Some of those theories are careful, grounded in evidence and cautious interpretation. Others move more freely, connecting distant ideas into narratives that are compelling, even if they are not strongly supported. The idea that ancient sailors stood on the ridgelines of the Appalachians, looking out over forests that stretched to the horizon, is difficult to verify. But it is also difficult, once imagined, to forget. And that is often enough, because in a place as old, as layered, and as partially understood as the Appalachians, the boundary between what is known and what is possible is not always as sharp as we might expect. Some things are documented, some things are inferred, and some things remain quietly in the space between. The Appalachian underground tunnel systems revisited, we mentioned the Cherokee tunnel theory earlier, but the fringe version of Appalachian underground mythology goes considerably further. It takes the idea of hidden passages and expands it into something larger, more structured, less like scattered caves, and more like an intentional system, something designed, or at least organized, with purpose. There is a subset of Appalachian researchers, people operating in the space between paranormal investigation and alternative history, who argue that the mountains contain an extensive underground complex of non-natural origin, not merely tunnels, but something closer to a network. In these tellings, the underground is described as a series of chambers, corridors, and interconnected spaces that extend deep beneath the bedrock. Not isolated voids, but continuous pathways. Not random, but arranged. The details vary depending on who is describing it. In some versions, the network is ancient. It is said to have been constructed by a pre-Columbian civilization of advanced capability, a culture that possessed engineering knowledge beyond what is currently recognized in the archaeological record. In these accounts, the tunnels are not crude excavations. They are precise, reinforced, designed with intention, ventilated in ways that suggest long-term use. The purpose of such a system is interpreted in different ways. Some suggest it was built for protection, a subterranean refuge in times of conflict or environmental catastrophe. Others propose it was ceremonial, a network used for rituals that required movement beneath the surface, through spaces that symbolized transition or transformation. Still others imagine it as part of a larger, now lost civilization that extended beyond the Appalachians, connecting regions through hidden routes. There is very little physical evidence supporting this version of the theory. No confirmed entrances, no mapped corridors, no artifacts that would indicate larger-scale underground construction of this kind. And yet, the idea persists. Partly because of the caves, partly because of the age of the mountains, and partly because of the sense difficult to define, but frequently reported that the Appalachians feel layered in a way that suggests hidden space. But there is another version of the theory that is grounded, at least in part, in documented history. This is the modern underground. In this version, the tunnels and chambers are not ancient, but recent. Built in the 20th century, primarily during the Cold War, as part of a broader effort by the United States government to prepare for scenarios that were never meant to be public. The most commonly cited example is the Greenbrier Bunker. Located beneath the Greenbrier Resort in White Sulphur Springs, West Virginia, this facility was constructed in secrecy between 1958 and 1962. Known as Project Greek Island, it was designed to house the entire United States Congress in the event of a nuclear war. It included dormitories, meeting rooms, communication systems, and all the infrastructure necessary to maintain continuity of government after a catastrophic event. For 30 years, it remained hidden. Guests stayed at the resort above it. Weddings were held, conferences were hosted, and beneath all of that, behind thick concrete walls and disguised entrances, a fully operational government bunker waited. It was only in 1992 that a journalist revealed its existence. That revelation changed the way many people thought about what might exist beneath the mountains. Because if something that large, that complex, and that significant could remain hidden for 3 decades in a location that was not remote, not restricted, but actively used by the public, then the possibility of other facilities became easier to imagine. From there, the theory expands. Proponents argue that the Appalachians offer a unique combination of features that would make them ideal for underground infrastructure. The bedrock is ancient and stable. Unlike regions with frequent seismic activity, the Appalachian Mountains have long since settled into geological quiet. This makes them structurally reliable for large underground spaces. The terrain is rugged and, in many areas, sparsely populated. Large sections of land are federally owned national forests, protected areas where access is already controlled to some degree. And perhaps most importantly, the mountains are already filled with natural voids. Caves, fissures, underground waterways, spaces that could, in theory, be expanded, connected, or incorporated into larger structures. In this framework, the Greenbrier Bunker is not an isolated case. It is an example, a proof of concept. From there, speculation moves outward. Additional bunkers, storage facilities, research sites, transit corridors connecting one location to another. A hidden layer beneath the visible landscape, built not in ancient times, but within living memory. There is no publicly available evidence confirming the existence of such a network. The government has not acknowledged additional facilities of this scale in the Appalachian region. Declassified documents confirm some Cold War-era infrastructure, but nothing approaching the vast systems described in the more expansive versions of the theory. And yet, for those who consider it, the absence of confirmation does not resolve the question. It becomes part of it. Secrecy, by its nature, does not produce clear records. The logic of classified projects is that they remain unknown until they are no longer needed, or until someone reveals them. The existence of one hidden facility suggests the possibility of others, even if that possibility cannot be verified. There are also the stories, accounts from individuals who claim to have seen entrances in remote areas, unmarked doors in hillsides, security presence in places where none is expected, trucks moving equipment at night along roads that do not appear on maps. These accounts are difficult to evaluate. They are often second-hand. They lack documentation. They exist in that same space as many Appalachian stories, persistent, specific, and just out of reach of confirmation. Taken together, the underground theories, both ancient and modern, form a kind of layered narrative. An old idea, expanded, first that there are caves, then that those caves might connect, then that someone might have used them, and finally that someone still might be. Whether any of this is physically true is, at present, unresolved, but the idea itself fits the mountains in a particular way. A landscape that already feels deep, already feels older than it appears, already suggests, in quiet ways, that what is visible is not the whole of it. The Appalachians rise gently from a distance. They do not announce their complexity. But beneath that surface, in rock, in soil, in story, there is always the possibility of something more, something hidden, something waiting. The black-eyed children of Appalachia, the black-eyed children, are a piece of paranormal folklore that appears in many parts of the world, but has a particular and interesting presence in Appalachian tradition. It is not a loud kind of story. It does not begin with violence or spectacle. It begins quietly. A knock on a door, a figure at the side of the road, a presence just outside the edge of light. The reports are, in their structure, remarkably consistent. A person is alone, or nearly alone, often at night, sometimes driving along a rural road, sometimes at home, in a place that feels safe simply because it is familiar. And then, unexpectedly, there are children. They appear to be between 8 and 16 years old. They are dressed normally, though sometimes slightly out of place for the conditions, too lightly dressed for the weather, or wearing clothing that feels subtly out of time. They speak calmly, politely. They ask for help, a ride somewhere, permission to come inside, access to a... At first, nothing seems overtly wrong, and then something shifts. The witness notices the eyes. The eyes are entirely black. No white, no visible iris, just a uniform, depthless darkness that reflects no light and offers no expression. Eyes that do not behave like eyes should. And with that realization comes a feeling. Nearly every account describes it. A sudden, overwhelming sense of dread. Not gradual, not reasoned. Immediate, physical. The kind of fear that bypasses thought entirely and moves straight into the body. A tightening in the chest. A pressure at the back of the neck. The instinct as old as anything human that something is not right, and that remaining where you are may not be safe. At the same time, there is often another feeling layered beneath it, a pull toward compliance. Witnesses describe a strong, almost compelling urge to do what the children ask, to open the door, to unlock the car, to let them in, despite the fear, as if the request carries weight beyond its words. It is the tension between these two impulses, the instinct to flee and the pressure to comply, that defines the encounter. Most reported cases end the same way. The witness refuses. They do not open the door. They do not unlock the car. They step back, or drive away, or find some way to break contact. And the children leave. They do not force entry. They do not pursue. They simply turn and walk away into the darkness, disappearing in a way that often feels too quick, too complete. The encounter ends, but the feeling remains. In the Appalachian context, these accounts take on an additional layer. Because while the specific image children with completely black eyes is a relatively modern description, the structure of the story is not new. There are older accounts, scattered through 19th century folklore and oral tradition, of encounters with figures that appeared human but were not quite right. Travelers on mountain roads speaking of children seen at night in places where no children should be. Figures that asked for entry or assistance or attention and carried with them a sense of wrongness that witnesses struggled to describe in precise terms. In those earlier accounts, the eyes are not always mentioned. Instead, the wrongness is conveyed through behavior, or posture, or the way the figure speaks. Something just slightly out of alignment with expectation. Something that the mind cannot easily categorize, but the body reacts to immediately. The black-eyed children, in this sense, can be understood as a modern expression of an older pattern, a refinement of the image, a clearer detail added to a story that has existed in different forms for a long time. Within broader folklore, this pattern appears again and again. The doppelganger, the changeling, the traveller who is not what they seem, beings that wear human appearance but imperfectly, beings that approach the boundary of human space, the doorway, the roadside, the edge of town, and ask to be let in. In many traditions there is a rule. They must be invited. And in that rule there is a kind of protection. In the Appalachian versions of these stories, that boundary is often emphasized. The threshold between inside and outside, between the known and the unknown, between light and darkness, a porch light illuminating a small circle of safety, a car interior closed and contained, a front door separating two worlds. The children stand just outside that boundary, and they ask. Skeptical explanations for these encounters vary. Some point to misidentification, ordinary children seen under unusual lighting conditions, their eyes appearing darker than they are. Others suggest the spread of urban legend through modern media, shaping how people interpret ambiguous experiences. There are also medical explanations. Conditions like aniridia can affect the appearance of the eyes, and low light can obscure detail in ways that make features appear more uniform. These explanations address parts of the phenomenon, but they do not fully account for the consistency of the emotional experience. That particular kind of fear, immediate, specific, difficult to rationalize, is a common thread. And while psychology offers frameworks for understanding it, particularly in terms of threat detection in uncertain environments, the intensity described in these accounts remains notable. In the Appalachian setting, the geography itself adds another layer. These encounters are often reported at liminal points, road junctions where one path becomes another, the edges of small towns where forest begins, driveways that lead from open land into enclosed space. Moments of transition. In older folklore, these are places where boundaries thin, not physically, but symbolically. Places where categories blur, where movement between states day and night, wilderness and settlement, safety and uncertainty is most pronounced. It is in these places that the black-eyed children are most often said to appear, standing just outside, waiting, asking, and whatever they are, whether misperception, modern myth, or something that sits more quietly in the overlap between the two, they fit the pattern of the mountains. Not loud, not obvious, but persistent, returning in slightly different forms across time, always at the edge of the light. The skinwalker parallel shapeshifting. In the mountains, the concept of the skinwalker, a being capable of taking on human or animal form, is most commonly associated in popular culture with the Navajo tradition of the American Southwest. But the underlying idea is much older and much more widespread. Nearly every culture carries some version of it, a being that moves between forms, a presence that does not stay, something that looks like an animal until it doesn't. something that looks like a person until something small, but unmistakable, reveals otherwise. The Appalachian tradition is no exception. It does not always use the same names, it does not always describe the same rules, but the pattern is there, layered into both indigenous and settler folklore, carried forward in stories that often sound different on the surface but share a common structure underneath, something that crosses the boundary. The Cherokee layer in Cherokee mythology, there are several figures that move between forms or exist at the edge of human and non-human identity. The raven mocker is one of the most frequently mentioned. In the tradition, it is a kind of witch, a being that can take the form of a raven and travel through the night sky. It is associated with death. It is said to prey on those who are close to dying, extending its own life by consuming what remains of theirs. But beyond specific figures like the raven mocker, there is a broader conceptual space within Cherokee belief that allows for transformation. Animals are not entirely separate from people. Spirits are not entirely separate from the natural world. Movement between states human, animal, spirit is not common, but it is possible under certain conditions. This is not framed as fantasy within the tradition. It is framed as part of how the world is structured, a world where categories are more fluid than they appear from a strictly modern scientific perspective. And within that fluidity, there is room for beings that do not stay in one form. The Scots-Irish layer, when the Scots-Irish settlers arrived in the Appalachians, they brought with them their own versions of similar ideas. In their tradition, there were stories of what were sometimes called haunt animals. These were creatures that appeared in the form of ordinary animals, dogs, birds, cats, but behaved in ways that suggested something more. A dog that appeared at a house just before news of a death arrived, and then vanished once the news was confirmed. A bird that seemed to guide a traveller along a safe path, appearing and reappearing just ahead, as if leading them. A black cat that showed up during periods of illness or misfortune, watching from a distance, never leaving until the moment passed. These animals were not always considered dangerous, but they were not considered normal. They were treated with caution, with respect, with the understanding that whatever they were not entirely what they appeared to be. In some stories, these creatures were thought to be spirits taking animal form. In others, they were witches or other human figures moving outside their usual state. And in some, they were simply left unexplained, part of the landscape of possibility that people accepted without needing to fully define. The modern accounts in more recent Appalachian encounter reports, the shape-shifting idea appears in a slightly different form, less structured, more immediate. Witnesses describe seeing something on a road at night, often in rural areas of West Virginia, or Kentucky. The initial impression is familiar: a deer standing near the tree line, a large dog crossing the road, something ordinary, something that fits the environment. And then something changes. The animal moves in a way that does not match expectation. It shifts its posture. It rises. It stands upright, not in a gradual, natural motion, but in a way that feels abrupt, almost mechanical, as if a different set of rules has suddenly taken over. And then it looks. This is the detail that appears most often in these accounts. The look. Witnesses describe a moment of eye contact that feels different from anything they have experienced with a normal animal. Not the cautious glance of a deer, not the curious look of a dog. Something more direct, more aware, more like recognition, as if the thing looking back understands that it is being seen not just as an animal, but as something else. And then, typically, it leaves, sometimes by moving into the forest, sometimes by crossing the road and disappearing into darkness. Rarely does the encounter last more than a few seconds, but those seconds tend to stay with the witness. Where these encounters are not evenly distributed. They tend to occur in specific types of places: remote roads, edges of forest and field, areas where visibility is limited and light is low, locations that, in other parts of Appalachian folklore, are already associated with unusual reports. There is often overlap. Regions where people report seeing strange lights, regions where unusual animal behavior is noted, regions where there are long-standing local stories about places to avoid after dark. The shape-shifting accounts seem to cluster in these same areas, which does not necessarily mean they are connected. But it does reinforce the sense that certain locations in the mountains generate more of these experiences than others. Possible explanations, as with most things in this space, there is no single agreed upon explanation. One possibility is misidentification. Animals can behave unpredictably, especially at night. A deer standing on its hind legs, even briefly, can look very different from a deer moving normally. Shadows, headlights, and uneven terrain can distort perception in ways that make familiar shapes appear unfamiliar. Another possibility is psychological. The human brain is highly sensitive to patterns, especially faces and upright figures. In low light conditions, it can impose structure where none exists, turning ambiguous shapes into something more defined and often more unsettling. But these explanations, while plausible, do not fully address the consistency of certain details. The upright posture, the sustained eye contact, the sense of awareness. And so, for some, the question remains open, not necessarily in the sense of confirming something extraordinary, but in the sense of acknowledging that the experience itself, the way it is described, the way it is remembered, does not fit neatly into simple categories. The boundary what ties all of these layers together, the Cherokee traditions, the Scots-Irish story. The modern accounts is the idea of a boundary, not a physical boundary, but a conceptual one, between human and animal, between natural and supernatural, between what is known and what is only partially seen. The shape-shifting figure exists at that boundary. It is not entirely one thing or another. It moves between. And in the Appalachian Mountains, a place already defined by layers, by the sense that what is visible is not the whole that kind of figure feels, in a quiet way, at home. Whether these accounts represent misinterpretation, cultural continuity, or something less easily explained, they follow a pattern that has been present in the region for a very long time. Something seen, something recognized, and something that does not stay long enough to be fully understood. The Appalachian Veil, a theory of place this, is, perhaps, the strangest idea we will discuss tonight. And interestingly, it is also, in some quiet way, the most commonly held. Not as a formal theory, not written down in papers or argued in debates, but carried in conversation, in memory, in the way people describe their time in the mountains when they are not trying to prove anything to anyone. There is a belief, found in various forms across multiple Appalachian communities, that the mountains themselves exist in a state of slight separation from the rest of reality. Not completely separate, just slightly offset, a step to the side. This belief is rarely presented directly. People do not usually say it in those terms. Instead, they describe experience, a feeling that settles in after enough time spent deep in the mountains, particularly in the more isolated regions, parts of West Virginia, eastern Kentucky, the borderlands of Virginia and Tennessee, where the ridgelines stack closely together and the valleys run deep enough to block out the horizon. In those places, people begin to notice small things. Time, for example, does not always feel an hour can pass quickly, almost without notice, or it can stretch, becoming longer than it should be, filled with a quiet that feels thicker than ordinary silence. People describe entering a hollow in the afternoon and leaving it at dusk, unsure of where the intervening hours went. Not lost, not disoriented, just displaced slightly from the expected flow. Sound behaves differently as well. Voices carry in unusual ways. A conversation from far away might seem close enough to overhear. Footsteps echo where there is no clear surface to reflect them. And sometimes, in the deeper parts of the forest, there is a kind of absence, a stillness, where even the background noise of insects and wind seems to drop away. It is in that stillness that some of the more unusual reports occur. People describe hearing things that do not belong to the present moment. Music, faint and distant, with no identifiable source. Voices speaking in tones or patterns that feel out of place. The sound of movement, footsteps, tools, activity in areas where no one is present. These experiences are not usually described as hallucinations. They are described as intrusions. Not overwhelming. Not dramatic. Just subtle enough to be noticed, and then gone. A moment later, the forest returns to normal. Another common description is visual, not full apparitions, not clear figures, but impressions. A shape that seems briefly solid and then dissolves into shadow. Movement at the edge of vision that does not resolve when looked at directly. The sense, sometimes, that the landscape itself contains traces of something that is no longer happening, but has not entirely left. This is where the idea of the mountains as a palimpsest begins to emerge. A palimpsest is a manuscript that has been written over, but not fully erased, where the original text remains faintly visible beneath the newer one. Applied to a landscape, the idea suggests that the present moment is only one layer, and that earlier layers, events, presences, experiences are still there, just beneath the surface, not active, but not entirely gone. In more theoretical terms, some researchers in the paranormal community have attempted to describe this using the concept of a window area, a place where the boundary between this reality and something adjacent to it is thinner than usual, not open, exactly, but more permeable. A place where information or perception can pass through in small ways. They point to the concentration of reports in the Appalachian region, not just one type of phenomenon, but many. Creature sightings, unexplained lights, disappearances, time distortions, auditory anomalies. Individually, each of these can be explained or dismissed, but taken together in a single geographic region, they begin to form a pattern not necessarily of cause, but of density. Something happens here more often than it does elsewhere, or at least something is reported here more often. The concept of thin places offers another lens. In Celtic tradition, particularly in Irish and Scottish folklore, there are locations where the boundary between the human world and the spirit world is believed to be especially close. Places where communication is easier, where encounters are more likely, where the ordinary rules of separation do not apply as strictly. These places are often associated with natural features: hills, forests, bodies of water. Remote, quiet landscapes where human presence feels secondary. When Scots-Irish settlers brought their traditions into the Appalachians, they encountered a landscape that already carried similar meanings in indigenous belief systems. Different language, different stories, but a shared orientation. Certain places matter more than others. Certain places should be approached carefully. Certain places are not empty, even when they appear to be. Over time, these ideas layered together. They did not merge into a single unified theory. Instead, they reinforced each other, creating a cultural environment in which the idea of a thin landscape, a place where reality behaves slightly differently, could exist without needing to be formally defined. And so, the belief persists, not as something to argue, but as something to notice. What to make of it depends, as always, on where one begins. From a scientific perspective, many of these experiences can be explained through known mechanisms. Human perception is highly sensitive to environment. Isolation, low light, unfamiliar terrain, all of these can influence how we interpret what we see and hear. The brain fills gaps. It creates patterns. It reacts to ambiguity with heightened awareness. From another perspective, the consistency of the reports across time, across cultures, across individuals with no connection to one another suggests that something about the place itself is contributing. Not necessarily something supernatural, but something specific, something in the way the mountains are structured, the way sound moves, the way light filters, the way isolation affects the mind over time. Or perhaps something else entirely. Something that does not fit neatly into existing categories. The mountains are very old. The stories attached to them are very old. And the people who have spent the most time within them, indigenous communities, early settlers, modern residents, have, in different ways and in different languages, described similar experiences. Not identical, but close enough to recognize. A feeling, a shift, a sense that, in certain places and at certain times, the world is not quite as solid as it seems, not broken, not dangerous necessarily, just thinner. And whether that thinness is a feature of the landscape, or of the mind moving through it, or something that sits quietly between the two. It remains one of the most persistent and difficult to define aspects of the Appalachian experience. Something you don't prove, something you notice. And once noticed, something that is difficult to entirely forget. The counterpoint. What mainstream science and history say, of course, not everyone finds these theories convincing. And it is important at this point in the journey to step gently out of the stories and look at them from another angle. Not to dismiss them, not to resolve them completely, but to place them alongside the frameworks that science and history have developed for understanding the world. Because the most grounded perspective is not one that chooses one side and ignores the other. It is one that holds both. The stories and the explanations. The experience and the evidence. Let's move slowly through the major ideas we've discussed and look at how they are understood from a mainstream point of view. The underground and the question of tunnels on the question of the Cherokee tunnel systems and broader underground networks, the scientific position is relatively clear. The Appalachian region has been studied extensively for more than a century. Geologists have mapped its bedrock in detail. Speleologists, cave scientists, have explored and documented many of its cave systems. Archaeologists have excavated sites across the region, from ceremonial mounds to habitation areas to burial grounds. What they have found is consistent. The caves that exist in the Appalachians are natural. They are formed through a process known as karstification water, slightly acidic from dissolved carbon dioxide, moving through limestone and slowly dissolving it over long periods of. This creates voids, which expand into caves, which sometimes connect into large systems. Some of these systems are vast, but they are not artificial. There is no confirmed evidence of larger-scale human excavation connecting these caves into organized tunnel networks. No tool marks indicating extended digging through bedrock. No structural reinforcements consistent with engineered passage. No artifacts suggesting long-term, larger-scale underground habitation. There is evidence that caves were used. Artifacts have been found near entrances, signs of fire, occasional evidence of ritual activity. But this use is localized, limited, and consistent with what we see in many parts of the world, humans making use of natural features, not reshaping them on a massive scale. As for the Cherokee traditions describing underground places, scholars, including Cherokee historians and cultural experts, generally interpret these as part of a cosmological framework. In many indigenous traditions, the world is layered. There is the upper world, the middle world, and the lower world. These are not strictly physical locations in the modern sense. They are domains of meaning, of spirit, of relationship. References to beings living beneath the earth are often understood within this framework, rather than as literal descriptions of physical underground cities. This does not diminish their importance. It places them in a different category. Bigfoot and biological evidence on the question of Bigfoot, the scientific consensus remains firm. There is no verified biological evidence for the existence of a large, undiscovered primate in North America. In science, particularly in biology, the standard for confirming a species is clear. There must be physical evidence that can be examined, tested, and replicated. A body, bones, DNA that can be sequenced and independently verified. Despite decades of searching, no such evidence has been confirmed. Hair samples attributed to Bigfoot have consistently been identified as belonging to known animals. Footprints, while sometimes intriguing, can be reproduced through known means or explained by deformation of tracks in soft ground. Photographs and videos are typically inconclusive, too distant, too unclear, or in some cases demonstrated to be hoaxes. From a population biology perspective, the existence of a breeding population of large primates would require a minimum number of individuals to maintain genetic viability. Such a population would leave traces not just sightings, but remains. Death is part of life, and animals leave bodies behind. Those bodies have not been found. This does not mean that every report is fabricated. It means that the reports, taken together, have not yet produced the kind of evidence that would compel a revision of biological understanding. In many cases, scientists suggest alternative explanations. Misidentification of known animals, particularly bears standing upright, optical illusions in low light, the human tendency to impose familiar shapes on ambiguous stimuli, and the powerful role of expectation once a narrative exists. It influences how experiences are interpreted. Disappearances and the reality of wilderness, the disappearances along the Appalachian Trail and in surrounding wilderness areas are perhaps the most emotionally charged aspect of this discussion. And here, the mainstream explanation is grounded in the realities of the environment itself. The Appalachian Mountains are not extreme in elevation, but they are complex. The terrain is uneven, the forest is dense, visibility is limited, trails can be poorly marked in places or obscured by weather and seasonal change. Cell service is inconsistent or absent. Weather can shift quickly, especially at higher elevation. Search and rescue professionals who work in these environments describe a consistent pattern in missing persons cases. People become disoriented more easily than they expect. Once disoriented, they make decisions that feel logical in the moment but lead them farther from safety. They may follow a downhill slope, assuming it will lead to water or habitation, only to enter more remote terrain. They may attempt to retrace their steps and become more lost. They may seek shelter in places that make them difficult to find. Children, in particular, behave unpredictably when frightened. They may hide rather than call for help. They may move continuously, covering distance quickly in bursts. The forest itself can conceal a person even from a close search. A body lying just a few yards off a trail can be invisible from above, especially under canopy cover. As for cases where individuals are found in unexpected locations, search experts point out that assumptions about how far someone should be able to travel are often inaccurate. Adrenaline, fear, and environmental factors can produce movement patterns that seem counterintuitive in hindsight. When examined statistically, the number of disappearances in the Appalachian region aligns with what would be expected given the number of visitors and the nature of the terrain. There are cases that remain puzzling, but puzzling does not necessarily mean unexplainable. It often means that not all variables were observed. Pre-Columbian contact and archaeological standards on the question of ancient Old World contact with the Appalachians, mainstream archaeology is again quite clear. There is no credible, verifiable evidence of sustained contact between Old World civilizations and the Appalachian region prior to the late 15th century. This conclusion is based on multiple lines of evidence. Archaeology relies on context. Artifacts must be found in controlled conditions, with clear stratigraphy layers of soil that can be dated and analyzed. Isolated objects or markings without context are not sufficient to establish historical claims. The inscriptions cited as ancient writing have been examined by specialists in ancient languages and scripts. They do not conform to known linguistic patterns. They lack consistency. They do not form coherent texts when analyzed systematically. The stone chambers are consistent in design with colonial-era structures. Their construction methods, materials, and placement align with known practices of early European settlers in the region. Genetic evidence also plays a role. Modern DNA analysis of indigenous populations in North America does not show evidence of significant admixture with Old World populations prior to European colonization, beyond the well-documented migrations that occurred thousands of years earlier across the Bering Land Bridge. This does not mean that no contact ever occurred. Brief, isolated contact is difficult to rule out entirely in any part of the world. But there is no evidence of the kind of sustained presence that would be required to leave lasting cultural or genetic impact in the Appalachian region. The Brown Mountain Lights and natural phenomena of the Brown Mountain Lights occupy an interesting position within this framework. Unlike some of the other phenomena, they are widely acknowledged as real in the sense that people do, in fact, see lights. The question is not whether they exist. It is what they are. The Earthlight hypothesis is taken seriously within certain areas of geology and physics. Similar phenomena have been documented elsewhere, most notably in Hesdal in Norway, where lights have been studied using instruments and have shown characteristics consistent with plasma-like behavior. These lights are thought to result from a combination of geological stress, mineral composition, and atmospheric conditions. Electrical charges build up in the ground and are released, producing visible light. The Appalachian region has the necessary ingredients for such phenomena: ancient fault lines, mineral-rich rock, conditions that could, under certain circumstances, produce electrical discharge. The atmospheric refraction explanation also remains viable in some cases. Light from distant sources can be bent and distorted by layers of air at different temperatures, creating the appearance of floating or moving lights. Neither explanation accounts for every reported detail, but together they provide a framework that explains many of the observed characteristics without requiring unknown forces. Holding both perspectives, what emerges from all of this is not a dismissal of the stories, but a reframing of them. Mainstream science and history operate within specific standards. Evidence must be measurable, repeatable, verifiable by independent observers. Explanations must account for known principles before introducing new ones. Within that framework, most Appalachian mysteries have explanations that do not require unknown entities or hidden systems. But that framework does not fully capture the experience of being in the mountains. It does not fully account for the way stories persist, or the way certain places feel, or the way independent accounts can align in tone and structure across long periods of time. And so, the two perspectives remain: the scientific and the experiential. Neither fully erases the other. They exist alongside each other, describing the same landscape in different ways. And perhaps that is the most honest place to leave it. Not resolved, but understood from more than one direction. Where even the researchers disagree, something interesting happens when you spend time in the Appalachian conspiracy research community. The researchers don't agree with each other. At first, that might seem like a weakness, a sign that the field lacks rigor, or that the claims being made are too unstable to support a consistent explanation. But if you sit with it for a while, the disagreement begins to feel like something else, a kind of honesty. Because if all of these phenomena were simple, if they could be reduced to a single cause, a single explanation, the people who spend the most time studying them would likely begin to converge on that answer. They have not. Instead, what you find is a landscape of competing interpretations, different frameworks applied to the same set of observations, different conclusions drawn from similar experiences. And those differences reveal just how difficult it is to define what exactly is being looked at. The divide within Bigfoot research on the Bigfoot question. The divide is particularly clear. The biological camp approaches the phenomenon as a zoological problem. From this perspective, Bigfoot is an undiscovered species, a physical organism, a primate, most likely, given the bipedal locomotion and general body structure described in sighting. Some researchers in this camp suggest a connection to Gigantopithecus, an extinct genus of large ape known from fossil remains in Asia. The theory proposes that a population of such creatures, or something related to them, may have migrated into North America in the distant past, and survived in isolated regions like the Appalachians. This camp operates within the expectations of science. They look for evidence that can be tested, hair samples that can be analyzed, footprints that can be measured and compared, environmental DNA that can be collected from water or soil. They set up camera traps, they document sightings carefully, noting time, location, and conditions. For them, the goal is confirmation, something that can be placed on a table and examined. The paranormal camp approaches the same phenomenon from a very different angle. In this view, Bigfoot is not a conventional biological organism. It is something that appears physical at times, but does not behave consistently with known animal biology. It appears and disappears in ways that do not leave behind expected evidence. It is often associated in reports with other anomalies: lights, sound, electronic interference, altered perception. From this perspective, the absence of physical evidence is not a failure. It is a clue. It suggests that the phenomenon does not operate within the same rules as known animals, that it may be something that exists at the edge of perception, or moves between states in ways that do not leave stable traces. To the biological camp, this is an abandonment of testable reality. To the paranormal camp, the insistence on physical evidence is a misunderstanding of the phenomenon itself. And so, the divide remains. Not just a difference of opinion, but a difference of framework. The underground theories' competing layers, a similar pattern appears in the theories about underground systems. Some researchers focus on the ancient. They argue that if an underground network exists, it must be the product of a lost or unrecognized civilization, something built long ago, perhaps partially collapsed or hidden, but still present beneath the mountains. Others focus on the modern. They point to documented examples like the Greenbrier bunker and argue that any significant underground infrastructure is likely the result of 20th century engineering, classified projects, military planning, continuity of government systems. And then there is a third position, a hybrid. In this view, the two are not separate. The ancient and the modern intersect. The idea is that an older system, whether natural caves or something more structured, was discovered by modern agencies and incorporated into new construction. Expanded, reinforced, repurposed, this position attempts to reconcile the lack of clear ancient evidence with the known existence of modern underground facilities. But it also introduces a level of complexity that is difficult to verify. Three perspectives, three different timelines, each drawing on a different kind of reasoning, and none able to fully displace the others. The disappearances, different kinds of explanation. The disappearances in the Appalachian wilderness produce perhaps the widest range of interpretations. Some researchers take a grounded, human-centered view. They suggest that the pattern may be explained by criminal activity, not necessarily a single individual, but the possibility of people operating in remote areas where detection is difficult. The wilderness provides cover. The trail provides access. The movement of hikers creates opportunity. This explanation is difficult to confirm, but it fits within known patterns of human behavior. Others focus on environmental and geophysical factors. They look at terrain, at magnetic anomalies, at the way certain landscapes can disorient even experienced individuals. They consider the possibility that specific locations may contribute to confusion, to impaired navigation, to decision-making that leads people into danger. This approach stays within the natural world, but pushes at its edges. And then there is a third group, more cautious in how they speak. They describe patterns, they note similarities, they point to cases that do not resolve cleanly, but when it comes to explanation, they hesitate. Instead of naming a cause, they describe a condition, places where people are taken. The word itself is rarely defined. It is left open, not necessarily implying a specific agent, but suggesting that in certain circumstances, the disappearance is not entirely accidental. That something about the place, or the moment, or the intersection of factors, results in a person being removed from the expected course of events. This is not a claim that can be easily tested, but it appears often enough in the language of certain researchers to be noticeable. What the disagreement reveals, all of these disagreements across all of these topics point to something fundamental. There is no single framework that comfortably contains all of the reported phenomena. Each approach explains some things well, and leaves other things unresolved. The biological model explains consistent physical descriptions, but struggles with the absence of evidence. The paranormal model explains the lack of evidence, but moves outside the boundaries of testability. The archaeological model explains known structures, but leaves room for speculation where data is incomplete. The environmental model explains many disappearances, but not every detail of every case. And so, the field remains divided, not because no one has tried to find answers, but because the answers, so far, do not align neatly. In a way, this ongoing disagreement is the most grounded aspect of the entire subject. It reflects the reality that the phenomena, whatever they ultimately are, have not yet been reduced to a single, stable explanation. And until they are, the conversation continues. Multiple perspectives, multiple interpretations, all describing the same mountains, and none, on their own, able to fully define what is happening. The role of trauma and cultural memory there is one more counterpoint worth raising, and it is perhaps the most sympathetic one. It asks us to shift focus slightly, away from the question of whether the stories are literally true, and toward the question of why they exist in the form they do. The Appalachian region has a long and difficult history. Generations of economic exploitation shaped daily life in many mountain communities. Coal mining, timber extraction, and land speculation brought wealth into the region, but much of that wealth left just as quickly, flowing outward rather than staying within the communities that produced it. The land itself was altered, stripped, cut, hollowed, often without meaningful input from the people who lived there. Before that, there was displacement. The forced removal of the Cherokee and other native peoples from their ancestral lands in the 19th century was not just a historical event. It was a rupture, a breaking of continuity between people and place, carried forward in memory and in story, even among those who came later. And in the 20th century, entire towns were submerged, valleys flooded for reservoirs, homes abandoned, cemeteries moved or, in some cases, left behind. Communities that had existed for generations disappeared beneath water, their physical presence erased but not forgotten. Layered over all of this was isolation, not just geographic, but cultural. Appalachian communities were often portrayed by the broader American society in ways that were dismissive or reductive as backward, as uneducated, as out of step with modern life. That perception created distance, and within that distance, local knowledge and experience were often overlooked or undervalued. When people live through repeated experiences like this, when decisions affecting their lives are made elsewhere, when official explanations feel incomplete, when their own understanding of events is dismissed, something changes. They begin to look more carefully. They develop a habit of reading beneath the surface of what they are told, a reflex of skepticism, not abstract, but learned, built from experience. And in that environment, stories take on a particular role. They become a way of preserving meaning, a way of encoding experiences that are difficult to express directly. Feelings of being watched, of being acted upon, of encountering forces that are real in their consequences, but not fully visible in their form. In this sense, Appalachian folklore and conspiracy are not simply attempts to explain the unknown. They are ways of describing lived reality. A story about something in the woods may carry, alongside its surface narrative, a deeper recognition of vulnerability. A story about hidden structures beneath the mountains may reflect a long history of things being done out of sight. A story about people disappearing may echo the experience of communities themselves being erased, relocated, or forgotten. This does not mean the stories are untrue. It means they are true in a different way. True to the emotional and historical experience of the region. True to the sense that there are forces at work that are not always visible, not always accountable, not always fully explained. In this reading, the mountains are not hiding something from the outside world. They are holding something, holding memory, holding experience, holding stories that carry more than one layer of meaning at once. And the mysteries that grow from that landscape are not just about what might be out there in the dark. They are also about what has happened here, about what has been lost and what remains. A quiet way of saying, over generations, there is more here than you know. There is more here than you have been told. Pay attention. The open questions we have travelled a long way tonight. Not quickly, not in straight line, but gradually, the way these kinds of landscapes ask to be understood. We moved through the deep geological age of the mountains. Through spans of time so large, they begin to feel less like numbers and more like pressure, something that settles quietly behind everything else. We stepped through the histories of the people who have lived there, each layer adding its own understanding, its own way of naming what cannot be easily explained. We walked through the stories, the ones that stay close to the ground, tied to specific places, and the ones that reach outward, connecting the mountains to ideas much larger than themselves. We listened to the theories, the careful ones, the unusual ones, the ones that sit somewhere in between. And then we stepped back, just slightly, and looked at what science and history have to say in response. And now, as everything begins to settle, it feels right to stop moving forward, to sit, not with answers, but with the questions that remain, not as something to solve before sleep, but as something to rest beside. Because this is where stories like this naturally end, not in certainty, but in quiet uncertainty that does not need to be resolved tonight. The first question is about the past. What is the actual archaeological history of the Appalachian region, and how much of it remains unstudied? It is easy, from a distance, to assume that the land has already been mapped, that the work has been done, that what remains unknown is minor. But the Appalachians resist that kind of complete. The terrain itself makes careful study difficult. Dense forests obscure visibility from above. Steep ridges and narrow hollows limit access. Weather changes quickly, and in many places, even reaching a site requires time and effort that restricts how much can be done. And then there is the human side of the question. Archaeology does not exist in isolation. It depends on relationships with landowners, with local communities, with indigenous nations whose history is being studied. In the Appalachian region, those relationships have not always been simple. There have been periods where research was extractive, where artifacts were removed without full understanding of their cultural meaning, where local knowledge was dismissed in favor of outside interpretation. Because of that, some knowledge remains held within communities rather than formally documented. There are places known through oral tradition, locations passed down through generations, a mound here, a cave there, a place in the woods where something older than memory is said to rest. Some of these places have never been excavated, some have never been formally recorded. What they contain, if anything, is not fully known, and so the past remains, in part, open, not empty, but incomplete. The second question moves from the past into pattern. What explains the persistent concentration of unusual reports in specific areas of the Appalachians? When researchers begin to map these reports' sightings, lights, disappearances, unexplained experiences, something subtle appears. They are not evenly distributed. They gather. Certain river valleys appear again and again, certain ridgelines, certain stretches of road, places where, over decades and sometimes centuries, different kinds of reports overlap. A light seen in one decade, a creature described in another, an unusual disappearance recorded years later, different people, different contexts, but the same general location. There are grounded explanations for this. Population density, for one. More people in an area means more reports. Accessibility matters as well. Places that are reachable are more likely to be experienced and described. There is also the effect of story itself. Once a place becomes known for something unusual, people arrive with expectation. An expectation shapes perception in quiet ways. A shadow becomes more noticeable. A sound carries more weight. But even accounting for that, the clustering remains. Consistent enough to raise a question, even if it does not yet provide an answer. Is there something about specific places in the mountains that makes certain experiences more likely? Not necessarily something supernatural, but something environmental, geological, psychological, or something that sits quietly at the intersection of all three. The third question returns to the oldest voices in the region, the Cherokee oral traditions. These traditions describe underground spaces, spirit presences, lights in specific locations, encounters at boundaries between forest and clearing, between water and land, between one state and another. They have been passed down across generations. They existed before European arrival. They were not shaped by modern media, not influenced by contemporary paranormal culture. They arise from a different way of understanding the world, one that does not separate the physical from the spiritual in the same way modern frameworks tend to. So what are they describing? Are they purely cosmological? A way of expressing relationships between people, land, and unseen forces in symbolic terms? Or are they also observational? Descriptions of real experiences preserved in the language available at the time. This question is not easily dismissed. There are documented cases in other parts of the world where indigenous oral traditions have preserved accurate accounts of real events, volcanic eruptions, sea level changes, migrations across thousands of years. Memory, when carried collectively, can travel further than we expect. So it is at least possible that some elements of Appalachian indigenous traditions contain observations of phenomena that were real, even if they were interpreted through a different framework. What those phenomena were, if they existed, remains open. But the continuity of the traditions themselves suggests that they are rooted in something more than imagination alone. The fourth question is quieter, and perhaps more difficult because of that. What happened to the people who disappeared and were never found? Not most of them. Most cases resolve. People are located. Explanations are found, even if they are imperfect. But some do. Some individuals vanish under conditions that seem, at least on the surface, manageable, trails that are well marked, weather that is stable, time frames that should have allowed for recovery. Searches are conducted, careful, systematic, repeated, and still nothing, no trace. No clear direction of travel, no final point of rest. The mountains, in those cases, remain silent. There are explanations. Terrain can conceal, time can erase, water can carry things away, animals can scatter remains. All of these are true. And yet, when faced with absence complete, unresolved absence, the mind reaches for something more. Not always a conclusion, just a question that lingers, not loudly, but persistently. The fifth question concerns the lights, the Brown Mountain lights in particular. They have been seen for generations, described in similar terms across time, across different communities, across people who had no reason to coordinate their accounts. They are not constant, they do not appear on command, but they return, again and again. Scientific explanations exist. Earth lights, atmospheric effects, electrical discharge, all plausible, all grounded, and yet none of them fully settle the experience. Not entirely. The lights continue to be seen, and each new observation adds to the same quiet question. What are they? Not urgently, not in a way that demands resolution, but in a way that invites attention. And then, beneath all of these, there is the final question. The one that does not belong to any single theory. Why here? Why do the Appalachians specifically generate this density of mystery? There are other mountains. The Rockies are higher. The Sierra Nevada more dramatic. The deserts of the Southwest more visibly extreme. There are other isolated regions, other places where people have lived for long periods with limited outside contact. And yet, the Appalachians carry something distinct. A particular atmosphere of story, a density of overlapping tradition, a continuity of experience that stretches from the earliest human presence in the region to the present day. Perhaps it is the age of the mountains, the deep time embedded in the rock, the sense, even if only psychological, that this is a place that has been here longer than almost anything else we encounter in daily life. Perhaps it is the isolation, not complete, but enough to allow local culture to develop its own patterns, its own interpretations, without being fully overwritten by external narratives. Perhaps it is the convergence, indigenous traditions, European folk beliefs, modern experiences, all layered in the same landscape, reinforcing each other in subtle ways. Or perhaps it is something less easily named, something about the way the mountains feel, the way light moves through them, the way sound carries, the way distance behaves differently than expected, the way time, sometimes, seems to loosen just slightly from its usual pace, not dramatically, just enough to be noticed. What we do know is simple. People have been asking these questions for a very long time, not always in the same words, not always with the same intention, but with the same underlying impulse, to understand a place that does not fully explain itself. And perhaps that impulse says as much about us as it does about the mountains. We are drawn to places that resist easy definition, places that remain, even after careful study, slightly out of reach, because they remind us of something we often forget, that the world is not entirely mapped, that there are still edges, still quiet spaces where certainty does not fully arrive. And in those spaces, there is room for something gentle. Not fear, not urgency, just curiosity. The kind that does not need to be resolved before sleep. The kind that can rest, quietly, beside the sound of wind, moving through trees that have been standing for longer than any story we have told about them, and will continue to stand long after. Tonight we travelled through some of the strangest, oldest and most quietly compelling ideas that people have attached to a single stretch of American mountains. Not quickly, not all at once, but slowly, the way those mountains themselves seem to ask to be understood. We moved through the geology of a range older than the ocean beside, a place that has watched continents form and separate, that has been worn down not by sudden force, but by the patient, almost invisible work of time. We sat with the stories of the first people to call those mountains home. Stories that do not separate the land from the life lived within it. Stories where the mountains are not a setting, but a presence. And then we moved forward, through the layers that came after, through settlers carrying older beliefs into a new landscape, and finding that the landscape answered them in ways that felt familiar, even when they did not fully understand why. We looked at the things that people have seen there, shapes at the edge of the trees, lights above quiet ridges, figures on roads where no one should be. And we looked at the things that have vanished there. People who stepped into the forest and did not return. Places that seem to hold on to what enters them, without explanation, without conclusion. And we sat for a while with the questions that remain, not as problems to solve, but as part of the landscape itself. Because some places are like that. They do not resolve. They continue. Some of what we talked about tonight is almost certainly the product of imagination, or misidentification, or the very human tendency to see patterns, to connect dots, to build meaning out of incomplete information. That tendency is not a flaw. It is part of how we understand the world. Some of what we discussed rests on real events, real histories, real gaps in what has been recorded and what has been preserved. Places where something happened and the full story was never written down. And some of it exists in a space that has not yet been clearly defined, not proven, not disproven, just present, observed often enough to be noticed, not understood well enough to be settled, and all of it, in one way or another, belongs to the mountains. The Appalachians will be there tomorrow morning. They will be exactly where they have always been. The blue haze will settle over the ridgelines again, softening their edges, turning distance into layers. The light will come slowly. It always does. It will touch the highest peaks first, then move downward, slipping into the hollows last, filling them gently, as if the day itself is taking its time arriving. Nothing in the mountains rushes. Not the rivers, not the trees, not the stories. Somewhere in those hollows, people will wake up. People who have lived their entire lives within the quiet boundaries of these ideas, not as theories, not as mysteries to be solved, but as part of the rhythm of the place. They will step outside and look at the same ridges their grandparents looked at. They will walk paths that have been walked for generations. They will carry, without thinking about it too much, the small pieces of knowledge that come from living close to a landscape. Which roads to take at night, which places to avoid after a certain hour, which sounds are normal, and which ones are not. They do not need to name these things. They do not need to explain them. They are simply part of how the place is understood. And in that way, the mountains live in them, just as they live in the mountains. There is something deeply human about a landscape that refuses to be fully explained. Something steadying. A reminder that not everything needs to be resolved to be meaningful. We are drawn to places like this because they offer something that is becoming harder to find. Space, not just physical space, but conceptual space. Room for uncertainty. Room for quiet curiosity. Room for questions that do not need immediate answers. In the right mood, in the right light, that uncertainty does not feel unsettling. It feels open, like standing at the edge of a forest at dusk, not afraid, just aware that there is more there than you can see, and that it is not necessary to see all of it. The Appalachians have been standing for almost 500 million years. They have outlasted oceans. They have outlasted species. They have outlasted every story that has ever been told about them, and they will outlast the ones we told tonight, long after the last voice fades, long after the last question is asked. They will still be there, quiet, unchanged in the ways that matter, holding what they hold, releasing nothing they do not need. And whatever they contain, the creatures people think they saw, the lights that appear and disappear, the stories passed down in careful voices, the places that feel different from the ones around them, the people who walked into the trees and did not come back, all of it remains. Not urgently, not dramatically, but patiently. Part of the long, slow continuity of a place that does not need to explain itself. Whatever the Appalachians really are, however much of them we understand, however much remains just beyond that understanding, they will still be there tomorrow. The same ridges, the same valleys, the same quiet sense that there is always more beneath the surface than what is immediately visible. And tonight, as everything settles, as the questions soften, as the edges of the story begin to blur into rest, that is enough, not to solve, not to conclude, just to sit with, and let it fade slowly into sleep.